I'm always looking for better ways to improve image quality, and in this video, I'm sharing my new editing workflow that produces amazing results. I'm editing this photo in full, this being the final result. My workflow has evolved since I last posted a full edit and includes a very important sharpening step, which I'll share later on. So I've got this image open up in Lightroom, and the first thing I do is take the image into DxO Pure Raw 4. I spoke about that plugin last week in a video. Very simple to do. I'm just going to go plugin extras, preview and process with DxO Pure Raw 4. This image is not very noisy, but I just want to tighten up the sharpness and just get rid of any little bit of noise that there is. I use D'Prime XD2. Just going to open up the one-to-one preview here so we can see what's happening on the pixel level. I'm going to leave force details at 0 and luminance probably at about 40. I find that a very good spot for most photographs. So you can see there's a little bit of noise there. But what I'm more interested in here is the lens softness. This is going to tighten up those details very nicely. So I'd leave it at either standard or soft. I don't go too strong or hard. Might just leave it at soft for now because I'll sharpen the image a bit later. So I've got the image open in Lightroom. The first thing I'm going to do is just to apply a flatter profile to the image so I have a bit more leeway in the contrast I want to add. Going to lens corrections. I'm going to click remove chromatic aberration because I didn't do that in DxO. I like to do that in Lightroom. And then I'm not going to add any profile corrections here. I don't worry about lens distortion or anything like that. And then going to go into basic and I'm going to add in some contrast. I want to flatten out the shadow contrast first. Don't like shadows that are too contrasty. So I drop the exposure, raise the blacks, softens out the image a lot, but then I use the whites slider to bring back a lot of contrast. Now immediately I'm being distracted by this dark patch here, also by that stick on the top there. So I'm just going to crop the image around about something like that. I might just crop it on the edge of that very dark area there. A bit more of a square crop for now. I think I might adjust that a little bit later. So now adding all that contrast has definitely added a lot of color into the image, which I'll sort out in a bit. But the first thing I'm going to do is I just want to add a bit more highlight detail to the animal. I'll do that with a subject mask. Just going to make sure it doesn't select areas that I don't want. So I'm just going to remove this area from the selection. And then there's a little bit here as well. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove green from this selection. So that's going to get rid of that area that's been selected there. So I'm going to go subtract color range and I'm just going to click on the area there and you can see now it's taken away that area very, very nicely. And what I might do then, it might have taken away a little bit of green on the animal. So I'm just going to add back a brush just to make sure that the area I want is selected. So something around about there. Let's just check that by dropping the exposure. So the area in dark has been selected there, which is quite nice. And what I'm going to do, because I want to fade in this effect, I don't really necessarily want it to affect the very edges of the animal. I'm going to intersect this mask with a radial gradient around the face here. So the highlights that I want to add will generally be applied in the middle and it'll fade out towards the edge. That definitely helps with the edge of the animal if you're adjusting or adding a very strong edit. I'm just going to add in some whites there. So now I want to darken the area that I haven't lightened. So I'm going to just maybe name this subject. And then I'm going to duplicate and invert that. So basically creating a vignette, really allowing that leopard to stand out very nicely. Next, I'm going to add in a little bit of light effect from the right-hand side. You can see in the eye here, the light source is from the right-hand side or the leopard's left-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a radial gradient, quite a big one, very big one. I'm going to soften the edge and just use the very edge of that radial gradient on the edge of the image. I'm going to raise the blacks. I'm then going to add some negative dehaze. Just bring that in a little bit and then warm up that selection a bit. This creates a little bit of an effect of light coming in there. I want to darken the immediate foreground just with a linear gradient. I'm going to darken that just to bring some more emphasis into the animal. Might just raise those shadows ever so slightly with a black slider. And then I'm going to drop the exposure with a linear gradient on the top. This is further going to emphasize that little bit of light that we've just added in from the right-hand side here. Now, one problem with this image I feel like that blue sky coming in from the back is very distracting. And I feel like if we can convert that into an area more similar to what the vegetation behind is, I think that'll add in a lot of mood to the image and it'll bring more intimacy to the animal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the subject mask. I'm going to duplicate and invert that subject mask. I'm going to call this, let's just call it blue sky fix. And then I'm going to intersect that with a linear gradient. Just basically going to select that area. And then I'm going to intersect that with a color range. So now I'm going to select that blue there. So that you can see that's now already targeting that blue area very nicely. I'm just going to increase this range just so it's grabbing some more areas around that blue area there. So what I want to do is I'm going to change the white balance. I'm going to warm this up. I'm going to decrease the tint so you can already see it's bringing the color more in line with the background. Now I'm going to use this color tool here. I'm going to click on this graph, and what you can actually do is then move the mouse over onto the image to select a green that is in the image. Now that's going to apply that there. It's a bit too saturated, so I'll drop the saturation. And then now I want to deal with the brightness of that area. I'm going to drop the highlights, maybe drop the exposure a bit, and then raise up the blacks. So now what we've done is we've aligned the color with the vegetation in the background. But the problem is we've still got those bright patches. So now that definitely looks like sky that we've just changed the color of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new mask with luminance range. I'm going to click in there, select that luminance range. I'm just going to increase the width of that range a little bit more. I'm going to subtract a subject mask to get rid of the area around the leopard. And then I'm going to intersect that with a radial gradient. I guess I could do that with a brush. I just want to select the area of that bright patch in the sky there. I want to subtract a brush, it's just touching this leopard a bit here. I'm going to subtract this. So now what I'll do is I'm going to increase the feather to 100% and I'm going to increase the size of the brush. And I'm basically going to use the edge of the brush to just feather that away ever so slightly. I don't really want to target that area around the leopard. Unfortunately, Lightroom doesn't have a way to refine the edge around hair at the moment. Hopefully that comes in a later update. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the exposure, drop the highlights. I'm not going to go overboard with this because you'll be able to see the edges between what's been selected. Something around about there. This is without the masks, and this is with all the masks we've created, so it's looking a lot better. So now I'll just touch up those very bright areas just with a radial gradient. Very small radial gradient just over those bright patches. Dropping the contrast and dropping the highlights. And just dropping the exposure there. You might need to raise up the shadows just to even out the darkening on those darker parts. Again, I'm going to take another radial gradient here. Drop down the highlights, drop the exposure, drop the contrast, and then just raise up the shadows and maybe some of the blacks as well. The tricky one here is going to be above the head, but it's not too difficult. Radial gradient, subtract subject, and then just drop down the exposure, contrast, drop the highlights, and then raise up some of the shadows. I feel like that area has become a bit too dark, so I'm just going to drop a linear gradient over there. Subtract the subject, and then just increase the blacks just a little bit, perhaps drop the contrast. I'm going to go back into that subject inverted mask to create more of a separation with the subject to the background, just to add more of a vignette there, and then go back to the beginning stages just to check our contrast that we've added. Just don't want to blow out anything on the leopard's whiskers there. So what I want to do now is I'm going to add in some subject definition using the subject mask we created, and then adding in some clarity, perhaps a little bit of texture. Texture will help sharpen up a lot of those details. You can see it's very sharp at the moment. So now what we're going to do here is perhaps add a little bit of clarity to the whole image, maybe some negative dehaze, just to soften out the image a little bit more. And then move on to the tone curve. I'm going to add in some more contrast globally to the whole image. Perhaps something like that. I'm going to roll off the blacks very slightly. And then point color. I mentioned point color on this image specifically a couple of videos ago, but I'm going to show you exactly what I would do for this full edit. I'm going to select the color on the leopard, visualize range, and then I'm going to just increase the range, something around about there, visualize range off. I'm going to shift the hue to a more warmer color. I feel like it's a bit yellow at the moment. I'm just going to shift that hue more towards red, and then increase the saturation. So I like that on the subject. Now I'm going to edit the background, but I'm going to use a selection for that. So I want to select subject. Just going to refine this subject selection a bit here. Take away that, take away this. I'm just going to subtract green from this color range. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert this entire selection. So now I've selected the subject really nicely. Let's just add in that little bit of detail that we lost on the nose there. And then I'm going to invert this entire mask to select the background. So I'm going to go to point color, going to click on what I want to change. Now I want to desaturate the green, but I also want to get rid of some of this yellow color here. I want to make that green. So I think we'll start there. Click on that green there, visualize range. It's a very small area that it's going to change. You can see there. I'm going to leave it like that. And then I'm just going to shift the hue more towards green, just to bring that more in line. That'll help simplify the image a little bit there. Maybe just drop some of that saturation. Okay, now I'm going to work on the main green in the background. Going to visualize range. Going to see what it's selected. I might increase this range just so it selects a bit more of the green areas. Saturation shift down. And to desaturate the image very slightly in the background. That just helps the subject stand out a bit more. Going to move on to color grading next. I'm going to add my blue into the shadows that I like. Drop it down to about 222 on the hue value there. And this is where I like to drop down the shadows a bit, just to add in a little bit more contrast. Now this blue's been applied to too much of the area, so on the balance slide, I'm going to increase that just to add that blue into the very deeper shadow areas. And then I might just change this highlights slider just to make the highlights a bit more punchy. Maybe drop the midtone slider there just to bring down the brightness value on the midtones. Looking at the image now, this green in the background I don't like the green the way it's been rendered through that mask. So I'm going to just do a global adjustment using the point color. Just want to adjust the hue to a bit more of a yellow hue there. I feel like that's a little bit more natural. Just want to adjust this white balance a bit warmer and perhaps play with the tint slightly. I'm liking the light effect on the right hand side. I just want to increase that a bit more. So I'm going to go back to that mask. Just going to raise the exposure, maybe just bring in some more of that light bleed from the right hand side. And now I'm going to create a vignette. I'm not going to use the vignette tool. I'm going to use a radial gradient because it allows me to position the vignette very specifically. Then I'm going to invert that. I'm going to subtract the area on the right hand side where the light is coming from. I don't want to make that darker. So I'm going to subtract that. So now you can see we've got a very, very customized vignette here. We're darkening the top and the bottom very specifically. Just going to allow that light effect to come in very nicely there. One thing, I feel like the left-hand side of the leopard is too bright relative to the light coming from the right-hand side. I'm going to create a basic radial gradient. Just placing it over the face here. And to drop the exposure very slightly there. Maybe drop the white balance very, very slightly just to cool it down. And then on the opposite side, I'm just going to add a radial gradient here. Going to increase the exposure. Just make that a bit bigger. Perhaps something like that. Before I finish off the image, I want to work on the eyes. I'm going to use a brush. Just want to increase the clarity on these eyes. And I'll do that with two different techniques. The first one, painted on the very bright areas here. Increase the whites. And then what I'll do next is create a brush for the whole eye. Add in a tiny bit of exposure, but mainly I want to add in some texture and clarity for that effect. Now, in the beginning, I spoke about sharpness. I'm going to go into the detail panel here. I'm going to remove all the sharpening that has been applied, just to allow me to look at what the base level sharpness is of the raw file. So you can see it's actually very, very sharp after bringing it in from DxO Pure Raw 4, but I'm going to increase the sharpness, but in a very, very small radius. If you're finding your image is lacking that very, very crisp sharpness, you can use this radius at a very low value and then use detail to bring in some more detail. Now, because this image is very sharp already, I'm going to leave the detail at 0. The sharpening, I'll leave it very low. But the main difference with sharpening a clean file is if you have all of that noise, Lightroom will sharpen all of that noise. But now that we've got rid of it, when we go to the masking panel, we're able to use a very low masking value here. Previously, with the high ISO, masking would need to be pretty high to remove the sharpening from that noisy area. But the problem with that is, if you look at the leopard now, a lot of the areas of the leopard has also been masked away to compensate for that high ISO. But now, because we've got rid of that noise, I'm able to use a lower masking value to allow more of the leopard to be sharpened. So there's a great benefit to removing that noise before you sharpen your files. Photo sharpness has greatly improved with this new editing workflow, but it's useless if you don't capture sharp photographs in the first place. Professionals use specific techniques to achieve sharp photographs, which you can learn about in this video here.